welcome to The Print. Today we have with us a very special guest, a senior Indian journalist based in Washington, covering India-US relations for almost 3 decades now. Seema Sirohi, thank you so much for joining us at The Print today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you.
And I'm so glad we can delve into your book, Friends with Benefits, which basically covers the India-US story. It's a HarperCollins publication. So I guess my first question to you, what was your experience going about writing this book?
So I was, one smart thing I did in my life is to keep all my stories that I had done for the Telegraph. For many years, I was their correspondent in Washington. And I kept clippings of my own stories and other important stories. And I carried those boxes with me everywhere. And I organized them by year, by month, and things like that. So I had a ready archive or a record of my own work.
Okay.
And then I went about basically interviewing some of those people who were still around and were willing to talk. That was the process.
Right. And from the book, you can get a feel, of course, of your wide range of network of high officials, both in New Delhi and Washington. So I'm sure you were able to tap into that for the book, of course. But there were a few things that I wanted to ask you, specifically how, writing this book after many, many years and having covered these relations, India-US relations for 3 decades, there were a few documents that I noticed, very interesting documents that not everyone has access to, like James Baker, the US Secretary of State in 1992, he wrote a letter to Nawaz Sharif saying that, if you don't rein in terrorism in Kashmir, the US might label Pakistan as state sponsor of terrorism. So those documents, that letter, you said that you had access to it. So how difficult was it to, sort of get access to those documents again or fish them out from places you may have forgotten?
Well, I got hold of that document only when I was writing the book, not in real time, not back in 91. At that time, of course, nobody knew that Baker had taken such a strong stand. In fact, at that time, we thought that Americans give Pakistanis a lot of leeway. But he did write that letter, and it was very important, and it was partly because the Indians were, coming down heavy on the question of terrorism. Accessing documents in the US, sometimes you're lucky because the National Security Archives is the largest repository of documents, declassified documents. You can access them online. They're very well organized. And occasionally something new comes up. They do a story, actually, like a journalist, that this is a news peg. And so it's kind of easy. But this one I got hold of through a contact who, after all these years, was willing to share.
Okay. And while you take us through this book from, for the first half, I see the pattern of going from American president to American president. We see through the book that no American president can shy away from the question of the nuclear question when it comes to India. So do you think there's a future in which India signs the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and joins the NSG?
Well, I don't see that that'll happen because the treaty will have to be rewritten pretty much, because it recognizes only 5 nuclear powers. And India, through the nuclear deal with the United States, which has been blessed by other major countries, is de facto recognized as a nuclear weapons power, but not de jure. So for that to happen, to change the treaty or, rewrite the relevant clauses, it would take a lot of diplomatic work, a lot of legwork, and I don't think there's any appetite for that. Because firstly, India is not demanding it, and it's not necessary because India's got what it wants.
Okay.
As far as becoming a member of the nuclear suppliers group, it's more dicey because China is a member. China will, I think, for the foreseeable future, will continue to block India's entry because everything is by consensus in the NSG. And as long as there's one country that says no, India cannot become a member, even though most other countries might support the membership. But the nuclear question has sort of hung over the relationship forever.
Yeah.
But in a different context now. Now we are talking, and the Americans did the nuclear deal. But when I first went there, it was the only thing the Americans were concerned about. India's nuclear program, missile program, they wanted to cap it. And the famous phrase, cap and roll back. So we've come a long way from there.
You actually mentioned that the nuclear weapons question in Kashmir for a long time hung over the relationship. So, I also wanted to ask you something, an adjective you used to describe Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, back when he was part of the Fab Four who helped, draw up the civil nuclear deal between Bush and Manmohan Singh. And in that, Jaishankar was a joint secretary of the time, and you described him as irrepressible. What did you mean by that?
He was just one of the most energetic diplomats. He was a chief negotiator at that time. He knew a lot about the nuclear question because he's done a PhD in that.
From JNU.
From JNU.
Yeah.
So he was also the diplomat who often briefed the press. So we all kind of knew him, and he would tell us what's important, what's not, guide us or mislead us, whatever the case might be.
Right. And I guess on that note, I wanted to also ask you a little bit about the lobbying in Washington. Earlier on in the book, you talk a lot about the anti-India campaign, sort of before the turn of the 21st century, led by, the likes of Syed Ghulam Nabi Bhai, who were found to be, funded by the ISI and things like that. What does the India lobby in Washington look like today, and how far has it come from those times?
Okay, so when you use the word lobbying, you have to differentiate between official lobbyists of the government of India who are employed, who are paid by the government of India to lobby on its behalf.
Yes.
And we currently have two firms, one Republican, one Democrat, that are lobbying for India officially. Then when you say lobbying in a more general sense, I think you mean the Indian American community, and
yes, totally.
How strong is that community in projecting the point of view of their own concerns or the government of India's. So they've come a long way as well. They are now, the Indian Americans, 4 million strong. And we have 5 members of Congress of Indian origin. So many companies have heads that are Indian American, like Google and Microsoft and all that. So we know all that. In terms of actual lobbying and pulling the weight, I think they still have a long way to go because they are not organized. In a sense, let's say the Jewish Americans are organized. They have one national organization to which everybody contributes. It has local chapters across the United States. Indian Americans have nothing compared to that.
They have Hindu American foundations.
They have, Bengali Association, Telugu Association, Tamil Association, stuff like that. And all the sort of pan-American organizations of Indian Americans, they're very rudimentary. There's no central office where fully paid, salaried people, professionals sit and do the work. There's nothing like that. While the Jewish Americans have that, We always talk about, we want to be like them. But nobody sort of gets organized or is willing to spend the money. And in terms of Hindu Americans and Muslim Americans, that also has come about. That started to happen with Donald Trump's presidency. The community got sort of divided. It was as if the religious divide in India came to the United States as well. And there was this Indian American called Shalli Kumar, who was close to Trump. he created a group called the Hindu Republican Coalition. And Indian Muslim Americans have been feeling alienated over the years, and they have joined hands with other Muslim groups in the US, like Arab Muslims, even Pakistani Muslim groups. So they just feel alienated.
And another thing I wanted to ask you about, well, actually, since you brought up Trump, I guess I wanted to ask you, I was going to save this as the last question, but if Trump comes back, if he's re-elected, what will it mean for India?
Well, if he's re-elected, India managed Donald Trump rather well, I would say, in the first term. As Minister Jaishankar said, don't demonize Trump, analyze Trump. And India actually had made a lot of gains during the Trump administration. It was, I call it stealth diplomacy. People under Trump were working perfectly fine with India and things were happening. The Americans during the Trump administration agreed to sell drones to India, even then armed drones after 1 year. They were hard on Pakistan, they were hard on China. Things like that happened. So if Trump comes for the second time, he has already said, he's courting the Indian Americans already. He wants the vote. So we can assume that he'll be kind to India. But with Trump, you never know.
That unpredictability factor is something you speak about a lot. How he also changed his tune on Pakistan within a few years, and how that had, effects and ripples on Indian diplomacy.
I think the bigger worry I have is that not many experts and people like that in the Republican Party are willing to work for Trump anymore. See, in the first administration, he went through so many people, he either fired them or they resigned. There's a very small pool left of real experts and, people who can man the National Security Council or the top levels of the State Department. That's my bigger worry. Because in the first administration, so many Republican experts signed a letter saying, we are not going to work with Trump.
Yes.
So that could, that has only reduced the pool. And now after all these years, he's done so many cases are against him and things like that. I don't know how many people want to associate with him. So how would he fill the bureaucracy is a big question.
Right, because even Pompeo came in after two guys and
Pompeo might run for president.
Yes, exactly. So I also wanted to ask you, it may seem like a broad question, who is better for India? Republicans or Democrats?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I've been asked that question before. From the book, you might get an impression that Republicans are better for India because in the period that I talk about, George W. Bush was seminal for India because he did the nuclear deal with Manmohan Singh.
And after Clinton and the sanctions and everything.
But now I would say the relationship is in a place that both Democrats and Republicans are fine with India. They want to strengthen the relationship. There's been no going back or any stepping back during Joe Biden's presidency, right? If anything, he has built on what Trump did, like the Quad, the Indo-Pacific policy, etc. So things are going in a certain direction. Both because of the rise of China and the need for America to have large democratic partners in Asia.
Another question I have for you, which might seem a little tangential, but there's a recurring character which is very difficult not to speak about her when you're speaking about India-US relations, which is Robin Raphael, a controversial US official in India-US relations, one who's expressed very strong views on Kashmir in public briefings as well. She recently met Imran Khan, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan last September in Islamabad. What do you make of a meeting like that?
Well, Robin Rayful, from India's point of view, has been one of the more negative characters in this play. And right from the time when she was Assistant Secretary of State during Bill Clinton's time, she questioned the accession of Kashmir to India and created a huge controversy. And she has never let up, you know. When she was out of government, she actually became an official lobbyist for Pakistan for some time. Then there was an FBI investigation into her because there was some suspicion that she was sharing classified information with people in Pakistan. But she was exonerated. And so I'm not surprised that she's meeting Imran Khan. She will work for Pakistan in some capacity or the other. That comes very naturally to her. So she's one of those few bureaucrats who hasn't tried to hide,
Inclinations.
inclinations. Exactly. That's the right word.
What was the most difficult thing about writing this book?
It came naturally because I just wanted it to be a straightforward account. So I guess the difficult thing was the time difference, trying to talk to some of the ambassadors and diplomats here in India and trying to cajole them and trying to find the right time. And then just collating the information. My publisher was somewhat unhappy that the book is so fat, because...
But you cover so much and it's very dense for 500 pages itself.
Yes, but I tried to make it interesting. I hope people don't get bored.
I, for one, didn't get bored.
Thank you.
Just for our viewers to know.
Thank you. I tried to write it in a very accessible, interesting manner. So an average reader who's not, on the diplomatic beat or doesn't follow international relations continuously or seriously would find it interesting and informative.
Because it's still conversational. And I don't feel like this is just my personal view. I didn't feel like I was reading the way we would write a report. The way we state facts in a sentence as reporters, I didn't feel that was happening too much in the book, saying on this date XYZ and then giving the designation expected of the person. I didn't feel that it was,
It was not weighed down by all that.
It was not weighed down by sometimes the format of reportage.
Yeah, I tried to make a narrative out of it, so that the reader would find it interesting. But at times I do mention all the designations and everything.
Yes, you do.
Because otherwise you get lost with all the names. There are so many characters.
Yes,
and it's a 30-year period. So a lot happened.
Right. And I guess my last question to you is, what was different about writing this book, which clearly is colored by your experience as a journalist, compared to Sita's Curse, which is something very different that you wrote, another book of yours that you wrote earlier on a few years ago. What were the processes like for each book and how were they different?
Very different books and a very different mindset I had to have. So Sita's Curse was my first book. I wanted to write it because I had done as a junior reporter a lot of stories about dowry deaths. And it was something that just sort of stayed with me. I wanted to document that horrific thing. And I chose just 5 stories from different parts of India to show that how this awful practice had spread across India through different communities, religions, even Muslims. It was happening among Muslims. So the process was different. It was kind of more grim. This was much easier to write because this was just something I was doing already. I was reporting. For that, I had to go out and do fresh reporting and travel a lot and try to track down family members and make them sort of recount and relive the pain. It was a grim book.
Right. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I'm out of questions, but anything you'd like to tell our viewers about this book that perhaps you didn't mention in so far?
I think one thing I would like to mention is that when I first went to Washington, the two countries were had a very testy relationship. They were usually not talking to each other. They were barking at each other for the most part. But now we have reached a stage where India and the US are talking about so many things, whether it's space, whether it's technology, whether it's defense, name it, and India and the US are engaged. So from estrangement to engagement, it's been a very interesting process to observe. And that's another reason I wrote the book.
Yeah.
Besides, the pandemic forcing me to find a project to do, that was something I thought was remarkable, that I was there when the relationship was kind of ordinary, if not bad, and very complicated. And now we are in a space where both countries have adjusted to each other and their requirements. And both countries have greater respect for each other, let's say.
In fact, like from where the book ends, which is sort of Joe Biden's, I think, start of his presidential term, from then till now, a lot has happened in the bilateral relationship itself. And we just saw Ajit Doval go to the US, the ICET come out, a lot of cooperation or intent of cooperation on space, tech, and those other broad avenues. And since you mentioned this again about how far the relationship has come, I did want to ask you about the fact that we've not had a US ambassador in Delhi for the last 2 years.
Yes, it's a very peculiar thing, and it's a very peculiar problem of this president. So it is said that Joe Biden owes Eric Garcetti, the person who's been nominated to be ambassador, some sort of political payback.
Okay.
And so therefore, the White House is sticking with this nomination despite all the difficulties they had on Capitol Hill. Because, as you know, an ambassador has to be confirmed by the Senate. And that has not happened.
And there's been actually Democrats in the Senate who are not exactly backing Eric Garcetti.
Yes. So it's a very peculiar problem, and a lot of American officials are tired of the fact that they don't have an ambassador, that 6 or 7 chargés have been changed in the US Embassy here. It's inexplicable. There's no real explanation. Every time we ask the spokesperson, she just repeats it like, boilerplate answer that we stand behind this nomination. But a vote has to be scheduled by the Senate. And that has to be done by the majority leader, that's Chuck Schumer. He's a Democrat. But even he's not finding it within his, schedule to actually do this. Why? Because he's not sure of the votes. It'll be very embarrassing that he schedules a vote and then they lose. That Garcetti doesn't.
Yeah,
so it's very murky. It's not good. And it's not good for the relationship.
So are we not going to have a US ambassador by the time Biden goes for re-election? Is that what we can expect?
I hope not. I hope they send an ambassador soon, or they change the nominee, or send somebody. Because this has become almost a signal that the relationship is not important. I mean, if you don't have an ambassador, it says something, no matter what the explanation. So I've written 2 columns about it. I've been tweeting about it since this whole thing came up. And as you know, Garcetti's chief of staff has been accused of sexual harassment. And that's the reason why some women senators are not ready to vote for him.
Right.
And Garcetti says he didn't know anything about it. Well, that's kind of where we are. And it would be good if President Biden finds someone else.
Right, because even I've covered this topic, and with most of the former foreign secretaries in India I've spoken to, or even some of the former ambassadors, they say that even if it's not, a signal that this is affecting the logistics of the relationship, it's still a bad look. That's what they keep coming back to. It's not a good look.
It is a signal, a de facto signal. And it is affecting the logistics of the relationship, because no matter how much time Secretary of State has for India and that Blinken and Jaishankar are talking directly, the fact is, there are a lot of, it's a large embassy here, the United States Embassy.
Yes.
So all these people need direction, and they need a leader who can interact with Indian ministers. So now if you don't have an ambassador, which Indian minister is going to give time to the CDA, to the charge,
Yes.
the number 2? So yeah, it does affect. Blinken cannot be expected to do the nitty-gritty of the relationship.
Neither
on a daily-
Jaishankar.
Nor can Jaishankar.
Yeah.
I mean, they have other problems to get, resolved. So,
Well, thank you so much. This is such a pleasure. I hope we can get you back for your next book.
thank you. If there's a next book.
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
thank you so much for joining the print today.
Thank you very much. It was an honor.